The spring that Willa Voss arrived in Judith Basin, the grass was still brown from a winter that had killed more cattle than anyone wanted to count. She came in May of 1886 with 2 children, a wagon, and a trunk that held more books than clothing. Meg was 8 and sat in the wagon bed reading without looking up at the mountains. Toby was 6 and asked every quarter mile whether they were there yet. Willa answered him the same way each time without turning from the reins. Not yet, soon. She had been saying that to herself for longer than the boy had been alive. The land she claimed under the Homestead Act was 160 acres of high basin floor east of the Judith River, flanked on 2 sides by coulees that ran dry by July. The soil was good where the grass grew thick. The wind came without invitation from the north-northwest, funneled by the mountains, and it did not stop. She felt it the first afternoon, standing on the ground. She now owned her skirt pressing flat against her legs, while Meg counted fence posts that weren't there yet. The wind wasn't cold. It was May, but it was constant in a way that made her note it the way her late husband Edmund had taught her to note things that repeated without variation. Edmund Voss had been dead 14 months. He'd served as a construction engineer with the Army at Fort Sully in Dakota Territory from 1878 through 1879, came home to Pennsylvania with notebooks full of observations and a cough he couldn't shake. Married Willa in 1881 and died of typhoid fever in March of 1885. He was 37. He left behind the 2 children, a small savings that covered the filing fees and the wagon, and not much more. And a leather-bound notebook, 200 pages, filled in his careful hand with observations about cold wind, heat materials, and the physics of structures in extreme weather. Willa had read the first 40 pages before she packed it for the journey west. She hadn't opened it since. She hired a carpenter named Pete Drum out of the settlement at Moccasin 9 miles north. Drum was a practical man with a tobacco-stained beard and no patience for conversation that wasn't about lumber dimensions. He looked at her lot, walk the perimeter, kicked the soil near the eastern coulee, and told her she had good drainage and bad wind exposure. She asked him what he meant by bad. He pointed northwest. Everything comes from there. You're in the mouth of it. He built her a cabin of 10-inch spruce logs with a steep pitch roof and a fieldstone foundation he was visibly proud of. It took 6 weeks. When it was finished, he stood back and said it was the best cabin he'd built in 3 years, and she believed him. It looked solid. It looked like something that would stand. She paid Pete Drum the balance she owed him, 40 of the $60 they'd agreed on, with the remaining 20 to come from her first season's income, and he left without ceremony. She moved the children inside, set up the iron stove, hung the curtains she'd brought from Harrisburg, and stood in the center of the single main room while Meg arranged her books on the shelf Drum had left unfinished, and Toby dragged a pine branch in from outside for reasons he could not explain. The cabin smelled of fresh-cut spruce. The wind pushed at the north wall with a sound like a slow exhale. She grew up in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the daughter of a printer named George Alcott, who owned a small press on Market Street and printed religious pamphlets, almanacs, and whatever else paid. She had grown up surrounded by paper and ink and the particular quiet of a man who read everything and said little. She had her father's habit of reading with a pencil, underlining what mattered, writing questions in margins. She had not expected to use that habit for survival. She had expected to use it for reading. What she had not grown up around was cold, not the kind that came for months and did not relent. Pennsylvania winters were serious, but Pennsylvania was not Judith Basin, Montana territory, and the difference became apparent the first week of November 1886, when the temperature dropped to 15 below 0 Fahrenheit, and the north wind hit the spruce walls and the cabin tight and solid as Pete Drum had made it, dropped to 44 degrees inside despite a fire she stoked every 3 hours through the night. Meg slept in her coat. Toby slept in his coat, in Willa's extra wool blanket tucked around him, and still woke twice crying from cold. Willa sat beside the stove in the hours before dawn and did what her father had taught her to do. With problems she couldn't immediately solve, she wrote them down. She wrote cabin drops 4 degrees per hour when fire is low. North wall colder than south. Wind audible through log seams near foundation. Frost on inside of north window by 3 a.m. She underlined north wall twice. Then she opened Edmund's notebook for the first time since Pennsylvania. She did not read from the beginning. She turned pages by lamplight, reading headings In the first lines of paragraphs, the way she'd been trained to skim a manuscript for its argument before committing to a close reading. Most of the early pages were about Fort Sully soil composition, foundation drainage, the specific challenges of building on ground that froze solid 18 inches deep. She kept turning. Then on page 47 she stopped. Edmund had written cold follows wind. Block the wind before it reaches the wall, and you block the primary mechanism of heat loss. The Army's instinct is always to build thicker walls. Thicker walls address conduction, the transfer of heat through solid material, and conduction matters. But conduction is not the primary enemy in high wind conditions. The primary enemy is convection air moving across a surface and carrying heat away with it. A wall struck by wind moving at 40 miles per hour loses heat 15 times faster than the same wall in still air at the same temperature. The wall doesn't have to be thinner or worse built for this to be true. It just has to be exposed. She read the paragraph 3 times. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind pushed steadily at the spruce logs. She wrote in the margin in her own handwriting block the wind before it reaches the wall. Then she kept reading. Page 51. At Fort Sully, winter of 1878, the double-walled dugouts built by the 2nd Engineering Battalion held interior temperatures 12 to 18 degrees warmer than the single-wall barracks at identical exterior conditions using comparable fuel. The mechanism is not insulation in the conventional sense. The gap between the outer wall and the inner wall traps air. Trapped air cannot circulate. Air that cannot circulate cannot form convective currents. Convective currents are what carry heat away from surfaces. Still air insulates. Moving air strips. The gap makes air still. She closed the notebook. She sat with it in her lap for a while, not reading, just thinking. The lamp burned low. Through the window, the black of the basin floor was broken only by the faint line of the coulees. She thought about the flagstone outcroppings she had walked past 3 times along the western property line, gray and flat and stacked by geology along the bank of the dry creek bed. She thought about the wind. She thought about still air. She did not have an answer yet. She had the edge of one. The man who ran the most consequential operation in Judith Basin arrived at her property on a Thursday morning in mid-November, riding a good horse and wearing a coat that cost more than Willa had spent on the entire journey from Harrisburg. His name was Garrett Solon. He was 55, lean, with a rancher's economy of movement and a businessman's careful attention to what he said. He ran the largest lumber operation between Moccasin and Lewistown, held notes on 6 neighboring properties, and had been supplying cordwood to basin settlers since 1874. He knew how much wood each family burned each winter. He knew which ones were running low by February. He knew which was to say he had calculated that a widow woman with 2 children and a new cabin on exposed basin floor would be out of options by March. He dismounted at her fence line and waited for her to come out, which she did, wiping her hands on her apron. He introduced himself without excess. He told her the basin was hard on newcomers and that he respected the effort she was making. He told her he'd like to offer her a fair price for the 160 acres, $180, which was more than most unimproved homestead land sold for in Judith Basin. He was pleasant about it. He was precise. He said, "You have 2 children and 1 winter behind you, and you haven't seen what February looks like out here. I'm not trying to alarm you, Mrs. Voss. I'm trying to make sure you have a choice before you've run out of them." Willa looked at him for a moment. She had grown up watching her father deal with men who came to the print shop with propositions. Men who wanted pamphlets printed that her father didn't want to print, men who offered to buy the press when money was short. Her father had a way of listening to a proposition completely without expression before responding. She had the same habit. She said, "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Solon. I'm not selling." Solon received this without surprise. He nodded once, put his hat back on, and mounted his horse with the ease of a man who had done it 10,000 times. At the gate he paused. "The offer stands through March," he said. "Winter has a way of clarifying things." He rode north. She watched him go. Then she went back inside and wrote his visit in her notebook, November 14th. Solon, $180. Offer stands through March. She underlined March and beside it wrote deadline. The woman who came 2 days later was nothing like Solon. Ida Pruitt was 40 years old, broad-shouldered, and arrived on foot carrying a cloth-wrapped loaf of bread still warm from her oven. She lived a mile east with her husband Luther and their son, a 16-year-old named Cal, who was already taller than his father. Ida sat at Willa's table and drank coffee and looked around the cabin without appearing to judge it, which Willa appreciated. She asked about the children by name, though no one had told her the names. She had asked around. That was the kind of woman she was. Ida didn't mention Solon. She didn't mention the winter. She said, "This basin talks fast and means well about half the time. You need anything, you come to me before you go to anyone else." She finished her coffee, declined a second cup, wrapped her coat back around herself, and walked home across the brown grass. Willa stood at the door and watched her go, and felt something she hadn't felt since Edmund died, which was the specific warmth of being offered something without conditions. Harlan Cade, the Montana Territory, agricultural extension agent assigned to the basin, came through on his November circuit 3 days after Ida's visit. He was a careful, methodical man in his 40s who wrote everything in a brown leather notebook and prefaced most of his observations with the phrase, "in my experience." He looked at Willa's cabin, walked the perimeter, noted the wind exposure on the northwest corner. When she described what she was beginning to think about, some kind of exterior structure to break the wind before it reached the log walls, he listened with the polite attentiveness of a man hearing something he had already decided wasn't viable. "In my experience," he said, "structures added to cabin exteriors in this climate create more problems than they solve. Condensation, snow load, moisture trapped against the logs." He paused. "You're new to the basin, Mrs. Voss. The people who've been building out here for 15 years haven't tried this. There's generally a reason for that." He said it without unkindness. He was a representative of institutional knowledge, and institutional knowledge in Judith Basin said, "Build tight, stack wood, endure." She thanked him for his time. After he rode away, she stood at the window watching the northwest corner of the cabin the way he had, imagining the wind hitting it. She was not a builder. Her hands were a printer's daughter's hands, nimble with small things, ink-stained for 20 years, not calloused. She had never laid stone. She wasn't certain she could. She opened Edmund's notebook to page 51 again and read the double-wall passage. Then she closed it and put on her coat and walked to the western property line where the flagstone ran along the dry creek bank. The stones were gray flat, layered by some geological patience she couldn't name. She picked one up, 8 pounds, maybe 10. She tapped it with her knuckle the way she'd seen Edmund tap things when he was assessing them. It made a solid, dense sound. Good. She walked the length of the outcropping, counting the linear feet of usable stone. 40 yards, maybe more. She stood at the midpoint of the outcropping and turned to look at the cabin. The northwest corner was exposed. Every wind she had felt since May had come across this open ground and hit the logs directly. If she built a freestanding wall of these stones running north-south along the western side, and then angling east along the northern, not touching the cabin, separated from it by a gap of open air, the wind would strike the stone first. The stone would deflect it. In the space between the stone wall and the cabin logs, the air would be slower. Slower air, something closer to still. She thought about Edmund's words, "still air insulates," moving air strips. She thought about the gap. The gap was the mechanism, not the wall. The wall just created the gap. She paced it out 20 inches between wall and cabin, close enough to be sheltered by the structure, far enough to allow air to sit without drafting. She thought about the stone flagstones stacked without mortar-needed weight and mass, at the base taper toward the top joints offset between courses to prevent cracking under freeze-thaw. She had watched Pete Drum lay the cabin foundation. She had watched him offset the joints. She had, without intending to learn something. She stood there for a long time. The wind moved steadily from the northwest. She turned her face into it, feeling it pull at her hair, and thought, "This is the thing I have to stop." Not the cold. The cold was a condition, like Edmund wrote. The wind was the mechanism. The decision came not as a conclusion, but as a practical next step, the way her father had always made decisions, not with a declaration, but with a first action that made the second action obvious. She went back to the cabin and told Meg she was in charge of Toby for the afternoon. She got the iron pry bar from the tool chest. She went back to the western property line and she started moving stone. It was the hardest physical work she had done in her life. Flagstone is flat, which makes it manageable, but weight does not care about flatness. She moved 12 stones the first afternoon before her back told her plainly and without qualification that she had reached her limit for the day. 12 stones. In her mental calculation of what the wall would require, 12 stones was a first hour of work. She sat on the pile she'd started and looked at the distance between where she was and where the north end of the planned wall would have to reach, and did not allow herself to calculate how long it would take her alone. That evening, she cooked supper and helped Toby with his letters, and sat by the lamp after the children were asleep with Edmund's notebook open to the double wall page. She had read it perhaps 20 times by now. She read it again. She thought about what it would mean if she was right. Then she thought about what it would mean if she was wrong. No money for more cordwood after January Solon's offer expiring in March, and children who slept in their coats. Being wrong was not a sustainable option. She was back at the stone pile at first light. By the last week of November, she had moved enough stone to begin laying the western wall. She set the base course wide, 2 feet of stacked flagstone, the heaviest pieces on the outside, faced the flat sides fitted together with the precision she had seen Pete Drum use on the foundation. Each course went up 6 inches. The joints offset. She learned by doing, which is to say, she made mistakes and corrected them, and the corrections taught her more than the plan had. It was on the 4th day of laying the western wall that Ida Pruitt appeared again, this time, coming across the basin floor without bread, walking faster than before. She stopped at the edge of what Willa had built, which by that point was 3 feet high and 12 feet long, and looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "What is this?" Willa explained. She explained about convection and still air in the gap. She was surprised by how clearly she could explain it. She had apparently been rehearsing the explanation in her head without knowing it. Ida listened the way Willa's father used to listen, with her full attention and no expression. When Willa finished, Ida was quiet for a moment. Then she bent down and picked up a flagstone from the pile and placed it on top of the course Willa had just laid. She looked at Willa. "Show me how you're fitting the joints," she said. They worked until the light failed. Ida did not ask permission to help, and Willa did not offer thanks in the way that would have made the help feel conditional. They just worked. The wall went up 4 courses that afternoon, which was more than Willa had managed in 2 full days alone. When Ida left, she said, "I'll be back tomorrow." She came back tomorrow and the day after. In the first week of December, Douglas Voss arrived from Billings. He was Edmund's older brother, a carpenter of genuine skill, and the kind of confidence that comes from being right about construction matters often enough to forget the times he'd been wrong. He made the journey to Judith Basin once each winter to, as he described it, ensure that Willa and the children were managing. The managing he envisioned was specific. It involved Willa's eventual recognition that the land was too hard, and Billings was closer, and life would be simpler if she were not attempting to homestead alone in Montana territory. He arrived on a Tuesday, and within 20 minutes was standing at the western property line, looking at the stone wall, which by then was 5 feet high, along 30 feet of its planned length. He walked its full extent twice. Willa watched him from near the cabin. His expression was the expression of a craftsman encountering a problem he hasn't been asked to solve, but can already see several things wrong with. "The mortar joints," he said. "You're dry stacking this." "Yes. It'll shift. First freeze-thaw cycle, these courses will move. I've offset the joints. The mass holds it." He crouched and looked at the base course. He ran his hand along the face of the stone the way Willa had seen Edmund run his hand along things he was assessing. There was something in the gesture that made her chest tighten briefly. "The base is sound," Douglas said, which was the most generous thing she had heard him say about her work. He stood up. "Willa, what is this for?" She explained. "Convection. The gap. Still air as insulation." She showed him page 47 of Edmund's notebook. He read it standing in the wind. He read page 51. He handed the notebook back. "Edmund wrote this from Fort Sully," he said. "That's flat ground, open plain. The mechanism he's describing depends on specific conditions of exposure." He looked at the cabin, then at the wall, then at the northwest corner of the cabin where the wind hit first. He looked at it longer than she expected him to. "Even if the principle is sound," he said, "you don't have the labor to finish this before hard winter. You're laying this alone. Ida Pruitt helps. One woman, Willa. He turned back to her, and in his voice was something she recognized from the 14 months since Edmund's death, a specific kind of pity that thought of itself as concern. There's warm and there's practical. What you're attempting is not practical. If you run out of cordwood in January, you can't eat flagstone. I'm not going to run out of cordwood. On what basis? On the basis that if this works, I'll use a third of what I'd otherwise burn. He looked at her for a moment. The wind moved between them. If, he said. Yes, she said. If. He didn't stay for supper. She watched his horse move north along the trail and stood in the cold a moment before going back to the stone pile. It was not that his doubt made her more certain. It was that his doubt clarified what certainty she already had. She picked up the iron pry bar and moved another stone into place. She finished the western wall on December 12th. 6 feet high, 42 feet long, 20 inches from the cabin face. She began the northern section the following morning, 26 feet angling east from the wall's northern end, placing the opening for the woodpile access at the northeast corner. She laid the last course of the northern section on December 19th. She stood back from it. Her hands were cut in 4 places from stone edges. The calluses on her palms were new and strange feeling. The wall was not beautiful. It was not a craftsman's work. It was a practical woman's work, which is to say, every decision in it had been made under constraint and necessity and with what was available. It stood 6 feet high against the northwest wind, and it did not wobble when she pushed against it. She walked into the gap between the wall and the cabin's north face. The wind was audible on the other side of the stone, but inside the gap between the wall and the logs, the air was different. Slower. Not still, but slower. She held her hand up. The draft was maybe 1/10 of what she felt on the open basin floor. She stood in the gap for a long time, not celebrating, not relieved. She was a woman who had read enough to know the difference between a demonstration of principle and a proof of outcome. The real question would not be answered by standing in the gap on a December afternoon. It would be answered by what the thermometer said at 3 in the morning in January. The cold that came before Christmas was the cold that clarifies. The thermometer outside dropped to 22 below zero on the night of December 23rd. Willa stoked the stove at 10 o'clock and went to bed. She woke at 2, which was her habit, expecting to find the cabin in the upper 30s, and the fire burned to coals. The thermometer on the interior wall read 51 degrees. She stood in front of it for a moment, looking at the mercury. She had never held the cabin above 48 in comparable cold. She added 1 piece of wood and went back to sleep. Christmas morning, Toby woke without crying from cold for the first time in 6 weeks. Meg came to breakfast in a wool dress without her coat for the first time since October. Willa served porridge and did not remark on it. She was watching the interior temperature while appearing to watch the children, and when Meg looked up and said, "It's not cold in here today," Willa said, "No, it's not," and moved the pot off the heat. That afternoon, she sat at the table and wrote in her notebook December 25th. External temperature approximately -18 degrees Fahrenheit. Interior temperature 6 a.m. 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Wood consumed since 10 p.m. 1 piece. Previous baseline under comparable external tempi 44 degrees Fahrenheit interior 3 to 4 pieces per cycle. She looked at what she'd written. Then she wrote below it, "The gap is working." She looked at those 4 words for a while. Not triumphant, just accurate. On the morning of December 27th, Garrett Solon rode past her property on his way south. She was in the yard splitting what she estimated was her 3rd week's supply of wood, which was less than she had split in any single week the previous month. He stopped his horse at the fence line. He looked at the stone wall along the western and northern faces of the cabin. He looked at the gap. He looked at Willa splitting wood at a rate that did not suggest emergency. He said, "What did you build there, Mrs. Voss?" She drove the maul into the block. "A wall, Mr. Solon." "For what purpose?" She set the next piece of wood on the block. "To stop the wind before it reaches the logs." She swung the maul. The wood split clean. Solon sat on his horse and looked at the gap between the stone wall and the spruce logs for a long moment. The expression on his face was not one she had seen there before. It was not dismissal or pity. It was the expression of a man whose calculation has encountered a variable he hadn't priced in. He said nothing further. He tipped his hat once and rode on. She watched him go, then she put the next piece of wood on the block. The basin floor stretched north of her property all the way to the line of low hills that marked the approach to Moccasin. The sky was pale and enormous, the way a winter sky in Montana is enormous, which is to say it doesn't look like sky so much as a fact about how small everything underneath it is. The wind was coming from the northwest as it always came steady and indifferent. On the other side of the stone wall, it pushed against the logs. In the gap between the wall and the logs, the air sat still. Willa split the last piece in the pile, stacked it under the lean-to, pulled her coat tighter, and went inside to start supper. Meg was at the table with her arithmetic. Toby had his pine branch again. The stove was warm. January came to Judith Basin the way it always came, without announcement, without the courtesy of a gradual approach. One morning, the thermometer outside the cabin read 4 below zero at dawn, and by the following morning it read 17 below, and by the morning after that, the mercury had dropped past the lowest mark on the gauge, and Willa had to estimate by the way the water in the bucket near the door went solid in under an hour. She estimated 30 below. She would later learn, 2 degrees off. She had 1 cord of wood stacked under the lean-to, and a second cord piled against the cabin's south wall, which was the side the wind didn't hit. Under her previous consumption rate, 3 pieces every 3 hours through the night, 2 during the day, when the stove ran lower, she would have burned through both cords by the first week of February. She calculated it in November. 2 cords through January was survival arithmetic, not comfort. Under the new numbers she was logging since the wall went up, she was burning roughly 1 piece every 4 hours at night. The second cord at this rate would last well into March. She kept recording. Every morning the interior temperature before the first wood of the day. Every week the rough count of what she'd burned. The numbers accumulated in her notebook in her father's handwriting, which was also her handwriting, close-spaced and precise. She was making a ledger of a principle. Edmund would have done it the same way. The first person to ask about the numbers was Luther Pruitt. He came on a Tuesday in the second week of January without Ida, which was unusual enough that Willa noticed it. He was a man of deliberate habits and sparse words, the kind of man who had opinions he didn't share until he'd had them long enough to be certain they were right. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, the way men stand when they've come to ask something they're not sure they should be asking. He looked at the stone wall. He looked at the gap. He said, "Ida tells me your fire burns slow, slower than it used to." He turned the hat in his hands once. "How much slower?" She told him. She told him the numbers: 51 degrees interior at 6 in the morning against 22 below outside. 1 piece of wood every 4 hours overnight. She didn't embellish. She gave him the figures the way Edmund had taught her. Numbers should be given plainly with units without interpretation because the numbers interpreted themselves. Luther was quiet for a moment. He looked at the stone wall again, specifically at the gap between it and the north log face. "We ran out of our third cord last night," he said. "Ida and Cal and me sleep in the main room now. Bedrooms don't hold above freezing." He stopped. "I've built in this basin for 9 years. I don't know what you've done here." "I've made the air stop moving," Willa said. He looked at her. He put his hat back on. "Can I bring Cal tomorrow? I want him to see how you stack the base course." She said yes. Luther and Cal came the next morning, and she walked them through the wall. The base width, the joint offset the decision to run the northern section perpendicular rather than parallel to close off the second wind angle. Cal was 16 and looked at stonework the way young men look at things they want to learn, with a hunger that hadn't yet become self-conscious. He asked better questions than his father. He asked why 20 inches and not 12. She explained, 12 would close the gap enough that snow accumulation could bridge it, pressing cold directly against the logs. 20 gave clearance through a heavy snow year. She had not read this anywhere. She had reasoned it from watching the way snow drifted against the cabin's south wall, which had no gap and packed solid against the logs within 2 feet of accumulation. Cal wrote it in a small notebook he'd brought. She noticed the notebook and did not remark on it, but something in her chest shifted at the sight of it. In the third week of January, Pete Drum came by. Not to apologize, which was not Pete Drum's mode. He came because his flue had frozen, a common disaster in severe cold, when creosote inside the chimney dropped to temperatures that gelled the draft, and he needed help clearing it. She helped him because that was what neighbors did. Afterward, he stood in her yard, and she could see him trying to find a way to ask about the wall without appearing to be interested in the wall. He said, "You still using two cords?" "Closer to one." He looked at the ground. He had called her plan wishful thinking in November in a voice loud enough that she was sure he'd intended her to hear it. What he said now was, "Condensation's not a problem. None." He nodded once with the small compressed movement of a man who has been wrong about something he was confident about. He left without further comment. It was not an apology. It was in Pete Drum's vocabulary something closer to an acknowledgement, and she accepted it as such. The blizzard came on the 15th of February without much warning, which was how blizzards came in Montana territory. The sky went white by 10 in the morning, not the thin white of overcast, but the dense white of weather that has made a decision. The wind shifted from northwest to due north and increased, and by noon it was moving at speeds she couldn't estimate precisely, but which she recorded as sound like a second structure being built on top of the first one. The temperature dropped to 28 below, snow horizontal. She brought the children to the main room, added 2 pieces of wood to the stove, and closed the door to the back room. She went to the gap on the north side once briefly to check the wall. The stone was solid. On the windward side, she could hear the blizzard as a continuous structural sound, the sound of weather running into something that would not move. In the gap itself, she stood there for 30 seconds. The air moved in slow eddies near the top of the wall where the wind came over. But at log height where it mattered, it was close to still. She went back inside. The stove ran through the night on 2 pieces every 5 hours. She woke at 2, added wood, lay back down. At 5, she woke again, 53 degrees interior. Outside, she could not hear individual gusts anymore because it was all one gust sustained a solid pressure of moving air. She added 1 piece of wood and watched the flame through the grate and thought about Edmund at Fort Sully in 1878. Whether he'd sat through a night like this in one of his double-wall dugouts and felt the particular satisfaction of a principle holding. The blizzard ran 31 hours. When it cleared on the morning of February 16th, the basin floor was scoured flat and white drifted in patterns determined by the topography Willa now knew well enough to predict. The drift on the east side of the stone wall was 4 feet deep. In the gap, the snow was a few inches accumulated from what fell straight down. The wall had broken the horizontal force of the storm completely. She walked to the Prewitt property that afternoon to check on Ida and Luther, which meant crossing a mile of open basin floor in snowshoes she had learned to use the previous month. She did not know what she'd find. The not knowing was the specific anxiety of a person who cares about other people in isolated conditions, a feeling that has no name but sits just below the sternum. What she found was Ida melting snow for water on the stove, Luther and Cal digging out the barn, and an interior temperature in the Prewitt cabin of 39 degrees Fahrenheit. Ida had the children and herself in coats. The woodpile was half gone. It had been a hard night. Luther came in while Willa was still there. He looked at Ida, then at Willa. He said, "How'd you come through 53 at 5 in the morning?" The wall held. He pulled off his gloves and sat down heavily at the table. He was not a man who showed defeat easily, but a night of 39 degrees and half a woodpile in February was its own kind of defeat, and she could see it in the set of his shoulders. He said, "I'm building the wall in the spring." "I'll help you plan it," she said. Douglas Voss returned in late February, which was earlier than his usual circuit. He had heard something in Billings, she never learned what exactly, because the basin talked in the ways all small communities talk, through travelers and supply riders, and the accumulation of unremarkable remarks that added up to news. He rode in on a Thursday and stood in the yard looking at the wall and the gap and the cabin in the way he had stood the first time, except that now there was no dismissal in his posture. There was something more careful. He was a craftsman looking at a thing that worked. He came inside. He sat at the table. Meg brought him coffee because Meg had decided at age 8 that this was her responsibility when adults came to the table with complicated expressions. He drank it. He looked at Willa's notebook, which was open on the table to the January temperature records. He read the column of morning temperatures without being invited to do so because he was Edmund's brother, and that was how they both were about numbers. He said 53 at 5 in the morning during the blizzard. Yes. I held 42 in Billings in January. Standard cold, no blizzard. My cabin is tighter than yours by half an inch on every log. Billings has less wind exposure. I know it does. He turned a page. He looked at the wood consumption column. He looked at it for what felt like a long time. When he looked up, what was on his face was not the pity she had grown accustomed to receiving from him, not the particular gentleness of a man who thinks a situation is hopeless and wants to be kind about it. What was on his face was something plainer and harder to name. He said Edmund wrote about double walls. I read his notebooks after he died. I thought it was theoretical. He thought it was theoretical too, Willa said. He'd built them for the army, but he wrote about them as if he wasn't sure the principle would hold in residential conditions. I'm not sure he knew it would work. Douglas was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window through which the stone wall was visible at the corner of the frame. He would have built this himself, he said, if he'd been here. I know. You had to do it without him. Yes. He didn't say anything after that for a while. He finished the coffee. He turned one more page in the notebook, the page where she'd written on Christmas morning, "The gap is working." He looked at that line for a moment, then gently closed the notebook and pushed it back toward her side of the table. He said, "What's the gap width on the north section?" 20 inches. He nodded. He reached into his coat and took out a small folded paper, a letter she saw from a builder in Billings who had asked Douglas about winter heat retention after Douglas apparently mentioned the Judith Basin situation in passing. He read it to her. The builder asked several technical questions. Douglas looked at her over the paper. I told him I'd ask someone who knew more about it than I did. She looked at him. He looked back. The formulation was as close as Douglas Voss was going to come to saying he had been wrong, and she received it for what it was. Garrett Solon arrived in March with a different kind of visit than the previous two. He did not come to the fence line this time. He came to the door, knocked, and waited. Willa opened it. He held his hat in both hands, which was not his previous posture. His previous posture had been the posture of a man with leverage. The current posture was something else. He said, I'd like to revise the offer I made in November. To what? $220. She had been expecting an increase. The increase was in its own way a form of validation. A man with Solon's arithmetic did not pay more for something he thought was worthless. She said, You've seen the temperature numbers. It wasn't a question, and he didn't treat it as one. He said, Luther Pruitt told Harmon Lyle, who told my foreman. Word travels, Mrs. Voss. He looked past her into the cabin for a moment, not intrusively, just looking the way a man looks when he's pricing something. The wall works. Yes. 220 is a fair price for proven land. She had thought about this. She had thought about it since his first visit through the worst nights in January, through the blizzard, in the specific hours between 2 and 5 in the morning, when the stove ran low and the fear that everything could still go wrong was hardest to argue with. She had thought about what it would mean to take the money and go to Billings and live near Douglas, in a house that didn't require her to lay stone in December with bleeding hands. She had thought about it honestly, which is the only way she knew how to think about anything. She looked at him. She said, I'm not selling Mr. Solon. Something in his face shifted slightly. Not anger, not surprise. The recalculation of a man who has run a competent analysis and arrived at a result he hadn't predicted. He looked at the stone wall visible through the cabin window. He said, the wall on the north section, where do you source the flagstone? West property line, along the dry creek bed. He nodded slowly as if filing this information away for reasons he wasn't yet prepared to disclose. He put his hat back on. He stood in the doorway a moment longer and said, Luther Pruitt is building one in spring. I know, I'm helping him plan it. I heard, he paused, I have a lumber yard, open on 3 sides. He stopped, and in the stopping was the thing she had been waiting without knowing. She was waiting for the moment when Garrett Solon's interest shifted from acquisition to something that looked more like inquiry. He didn't ask the question directly. He said, if a man wanted to understand the gap measurements, who would he talk to? He'd talk to me, Willa said. Solon looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man who has just reclassified a variable and left. She did not feel triumphant. She stood at the door and watched him ride north and felt something quieter than triumph. Something that had no clear name, but was related to the feeling of a ledger that finally balanced. She had built a wall against a man's certainty, the same way she'd built the stone wall against the wind, not through confrontation, but through the patient accumulation of evidence. Both walls were still standing. The letter from the Montana Territory Land Office arrived on the 1st of April, carried by a supply rider from Moccasin. She sat at the table and opened it carefully, the way her father had taught her to open correspondence that mattered. The letter confirmed that her improvements, the cabin, the well, the garden acreage, the drainage work on the eastern coulee, and what she had described on the form as a wind management structure for agricultural purposes, satisfied the improvement requirements of the Homestead Act. Her title to the 160 acres was confirmed. She read the letter twice. She folded it once along the existing crease. She set it on the table in the exact center. She went to the stove and added wood, not because the fire needed it yet, but because her hands needed to do something specific. She opened Edmund's notebook to the first page, not a page she'd read often, just the first page, which had nothing on it but the date he'd started it, October 1877, before Fort Sully and his name in the handwriting she had been in love with for 10 years. She looked at the name for a moment, then she closed the notebook. She was still in Judith Basin. The land was hers. The wall was standing. The title said so in the formal script of the Territory of Montana. Harlan Cade came through on his spring circuit in the second week of April. He arrived without the county extension office's usual advance notice, which told her he'd arranged the visit deliberately. He had with him a man she hadn't met who introduced himself as a field surveyor from the Territory Agricultural Office in Helena. The surveyor had a calibrated thermometer and a notebook larger than Cade's. He measured the wall. He measured the gap. He asked Willa to explain the mechanism in her own words, which she did standing in the gap between the stone and the logs while the April wind moved around them. The surveyor wrote everything down. Cade stood slightly to the side and said almost nothing. When the surveyor went to measure the northern section, Cade stayed behind. He stood in the yard looking at the cabin, the gap, the wall. Then he looked at Willa. "I told you in November that no one in the basin had tried this," he said. "I said there was probably a reason for that." "You did." "I was using absence of evidence as evidence of absence." He said it flatly without decoration, as a man stating a professional mistake in professional terms. "That's not good practice." "No," she said, "it isn't." He looked at the gap once more. He opened his notebook and wrote something, closed it. He said, "The surveyor will want to write up a summary for the agricultural bulletin. They'll want to credit the technique. Credit it to my husband. He developed the principle at Fort Sully." Cade looked at her. "You adapted it. You found the local material, calculated the gap width, planned the angles for this specific site." "I applied his principle to my situation." "That is in my experience," Cade said, "how most useful engineering actually works." He paused. "We'll include both names." She didn't argue further. There were things worth arguing about and things that weren't, and the question of whose name appeared in an agricultural bulletin was not in the first category. When both men rode away that afternoon, she stood at the edge of the western wall and ran her hand along the top course of stone. The flagstone was cold despite the April sun, retaining the winter's temperature in its mass, slow to give up what it had absorbed. The surface was rough under her palm. She pressed her hand flat against it and felt the weight and solidity of every course beneath it. 42 feet of stone she had moved from the creek bank and stacked herself in December. With bleeding hands, while a man she didn't know had a deadline on her land, in a winter she'd never seen before, was trying to clarify her options for her. The stone was still there. She pressed her hand against it for a moment longer, feeling its cold, its density, its absolute refusal to be otherwise than what it was. Then she went inside to start the afternoon. Word count, part 26318, state check, part 1 complete 6247 words. Part 2 complete 6318 words. Confirmed. Proceeding with part 3, maintaining all constraints. Spring came to Judith Basin the way it always came after a hard winter, Not gently but grudgingly, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, while the north coulees held ice into May. The grass that pushed up through the melt was greener than anything Willa had seen in her first spring here, or perhaps she was simply paying closer attention now. She had learned in 14 months to pay attention to things she had previously looked past. Luther Pruitt broke ground on his windwall in the last week of April. He and Cal came to Willa's property first early on a Monday morning, and she walked them through the western section again with a different purpose than the first time. The first time she'd been explaining a principle. Now she was teaching a method. The difference was specific. Explaining a principle could be done with words, but teaching a method required standing at the base course and showing where the weight had to go, which stones nested and which ones would rock. How to read the face of a flagstone for the fracture lines that meant it would split under freeze pressure. Cal wrote in his notebook. Luther watched her hands. They spent the morning at Willa's wall. In the afternoon, she walked with them to the Prewitt property, and they assessed the exposure together the same way she had assessed her own, in the winter dark, standing at the corners, turning into the wind, tracing the angles. Luther's northwest exposure was worse than hers. In one respect, his cabin sat lower in a shallow depression that funneled air, but better in another, because he had more flagstone available along his eastern fence line than she'd had on her western property. More material, less distance to carry it. She told him 20 inches minimum gap, the same as hers. He said, could he do 16 to save stone? She said only if he was certain the winter snowfall wouldn't drift past 8 inches. In the gap, and in Judith Basin, she wouldn't be certain of that. He said 20 inches. Cal wrote it down. By the end of May, 3 other families had asked Willa about the wall. She answered every question anyone asked her. She didn't travel to their properties unless they asked her to, but 2 of them did ask, and she went. A woman named Hester Garth, who ran a small stock operation 3 miles south, wanted to know if the principle applied to a barn structure rather than a residence. Willa thought about it for a day before answering the mechanics were the same, but a barn's heat load was different, generated by animals rather than a stove distributed differently through the structure. The gap width might need to be wider to account for moisture from livestock breath. She told Hester this and told her she was working from principle rather than specific experience with barns, which she thought Hester deserved to know. Hester built the wall anyway. She reported back in November that her horses had come through the first cold snap in better condition than the previous year. The surveyor from Helena sent Willa a copy of the agricultural bulletin notice in June. It was 4 paragraphs technical in its language describing the double shield principle and its application in Judith Basin, with specific reference to the flagstone construction method. The credit line read, Principle developed by Edmund Voss, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Fort Sully, Dakota Territory, 1878 to 79. Field adaptation by Willa Voss, Judith Basin, Montana Territory, 1886 to 87. She read it once at the table, then set it beside Edmund's notebook, which sat in its usual place near the lamp. She did not frame it. She did not write about it in her records. She set it down and made supper. Ida Prewitt came that evening, which was not unusual, and saw the bulletin notice on the table. She picked it up and read it, which was also not unusual. Ida read everything she encountered, a trait Willa had recognized as a form of respect, the same respect her father paid to written things. Ida set it back down and said, They spelled Edmund's name right. Yes? And yours? Yes. Ida sat down. Toby climbed onto the bench beside her because Toby had decided at some point during the winter that Ida was a person in whose vicinity he preferred to sit. Ida put her arm around him without looking the practiced, automatic affection of a woman who had raised a son. She said to Willa, Are you glad you stayed? Willa considered the question the way she considered all questions she hadn't been asked before without hurrying. I don't think I thought of it as staying, she said. I thought of it as not leaving. Ida looked at her. What's the difference? Staying is a choice you make every day. Not leaving is a fact about who you are. Ida was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Edmund knew that about you. It was not a question, but Willa answered it anyway. He said I was the most stubborn person he had ever loved. She paused. He meant it as a compliment. I took it as one. The summer of 1887 was good growing weather, better than she'd expected from a basin floor at this elevation. She put in a larger kitchen garden than the previous year, added a row of root vegetables she could store through winter, and spent 2 weeks in August reinforcing the base course of the stone wall where the spring melt had shifted two sections slightly. The shifting had been minor, the wall had held structurally through the whole winter, but she packed the gaps with smaller stones and reset the displaced courses. When she was finished, the wall was tighter than it had started. Douglas came in September. This visit was different from all the previous ones. He came not to check on the widow and her children, which was the premise, however kindly meant, of every visit before, but because he had a specific question about a building project in Billings. He was constructing a storage building for a client who dealt in dry goods, and the client had complained for 3 consecutive winters about stock damaged by temperature fluctuation. Douglas wanted to know whether the double shield gap principle could be adapted for a commercial structure with vertical board and batten exterior rather than log. Willa thought about it while she made coffee. She said board and batten had less thermal mass than spruce log, which meant the inner wall would lose heat faster in the absence of convective protection, which in turn meant the gap was more critical, not less. She would increase the gap to 24 inches for a commercial building with board exterior. She would also close the top of the gap with a ventilated overhang rather than leaving it fully open. Commercial buildings had more moisture sources than residences, and moisture management in the gap would matter more. Douglas wrote this down. He wrote it in a notebook he had brought specifically for that purpose. She noticed the notebook. She had spent 2 years watching men take things from her reluctantly or not at all. Watching Edmund's brother write down what she said in a notebook he'd brought to hold, it was something she had to look at sideways, the way you look at something bright. He stayed for supper. He helped Toby with the arithmetic problem that had been defeating Toby for 3 days. He told Meg a story about Edmund as a young man, a specific story Willa hadn't heard about Edmund dismantling a neighbor's fence in Pennsylvania at age 15, because he was certain the fence posts were improperly set and would rot within 2 years. They were. Meg listened with her chin in her hands, the way she listened to things she intended to remember. Willa listened from the kitchen. After the children were in bed, Douglas sat at the table with his coffee and said, "I told Harmon Lyle about the gap principle last month. Harmon has a cousin building in Wyoming territory. He asked if he could pass along the information. Of course. I told him to tell the cousin to ask you if he had technical questions." She looked at him. He looked back with the expression she had come to recognize over the past year as his version of an apology, which was not an apology in any conventional sense, but was a reorganization of how he treated her in practice. She accepted it for what it was, the same way she'd accepted his acknowledgement in February. The second winter, 1887 to 1888, proved the principle at a scale the first winter hadn't. The cold that came in December of 1887 was deeper than the previous year. The territory newspapers would later call the stretch from December through February the worst sustained cold in a decade. The thermometer outside Willa's cabin read 31 below on the night of December 14th, the coldest temperature she had recorded. Inside, 56 degrees at 4 in the morning. She had not stoked the fire since midnight. She lay in bed for a moment after reading the thermometer, not moving, taking stock of this fact. 56 degrees against 31 below outside. The wall on the western and northern faces, now in its second winter and settled into its final position, was doing precisely what she had calculated it would do, which was stop the wind before it reached the logs, which made the air in the gap still, which made still air into insulation, which kept the heat she generated inside the structure where she had generated it. She had done this. She had read Edmund's principle in a cold cabin in November of 1886, walked to a dry creek bed, picked up a stone, and begun. What she had built was not elegant. It was not the work of a trained engineer or an experienced mason. It was the work of a woman who had needed it to work and had made it work, which was a different kind of credential and in some conditions a more reliable one. She didn't think these things in those terms, lying in bed at 4 in the morning with a thermometer reading 56. She thought the children are warm. That was the thought. Simple, complete, requiring nothing added to it. 11 cabins in the basin now had some form of the double shield, most built in the spring and summer of 1887, ranging from Luther's full flagstone construction to simpler versions using vertical board screens with straw packing in the gap. The results varied by execution, but the principle held in every case. The Agricultural Extension Office had received 3 written inquiries about the Judith Basin method from other Montana territories. Cade told her this in November, not with the tone of a man delivering news, but with the tone of a man correcting a record he had personally contributed to distorting. In January of 1888, Garrett Solon came to her door for the 3rd time. He did not offer to buy the land. He stood on her porch and said, "I have a problem with my lumber yard. The open sides are costing me and winter stock is warping from temperature swings." He paused. "I want to build a windshield on the north and west exposure. I want to do it right." She looked at him for a moment. This was the man who had bought Pete Drum's debt and called it due in the week she had least money. This was the man who had asked a pointed question about her property rights at a public meeting. This was the man whose deadline she had outlasted. She understood all of that clearly without bitterness, because bitterness required energy she had found better uses for, but without forgetting it either. Because forgetting would have been a kind of carelessness she couldn't afford. She said, "Come in, sit down." He came in, he sat down. She poured coffee and asked him the relevant questions, the yard dimensions, the prevailing wind direction, what materials he had access to, whether the structure needed to accommodate wagon access on the north side. He answered each question precisely, which was the quality she had noticed about him from the first visit. Whatever else he was precise. She drew a rough diagram on paper. She told him the gap width, the overhang configuration she described to Douglas in September, the ventilation requirements for a commercial structure. He looked at the diagram. He looked at her. He said, "How much do I owe you for this?" "Nothing." He considered this. "I'd like to pay." "I know you would. I'm telling you not to." She picked up the diagram and handed it to him. "The principle came from my husband. I built the first one to keep my children from freezing. If it helps your lumber yard stay dry, that's fine. I don't need payment for it." He took the diagram. He sat for a moment longer, the way a man sits when he's received something he wasn't expecting and needs a moment to reclassify it. He said, "You're going to stay in the basin." "Yes." He nodded once. He picked up his hat. He said almost to himself, "I should have calculated that in November of '86. He stood. "Good morning, Mrs. Voss." He left. She listened to his horse move away north and sat at the table with her coffee, which had gone slightly cold, and held the cup in both hands. She thought about November of 1886, the first visit, the offer, the deadline. She thought about where she had been then, one winter, into a decision she hadn't fully tested, $40 in a tin box, Edmund's notebook open on the table to page 47. She thought about how she had not known that November whether any of it would work. She had known the principle. She had not known whether the principle would be enough. It had been enough, more than enough. It had been, she thought, exactly what it needed to be. The bulletin from Helena ran in the spring of 1888. 4 paragraphs in the Agricultural Extension Circular distributed to homesteaders across Montana Territory. By summer, she had received 2 written inquiries directly, one from a woman in the Bitterroot Valley asking about adaptation for a different stone type, one from a builder in Bozeman asking about commercial applications. She answered both letters in full with diagrams. By the winter of 1888 to 1889, Cade reported that 17 structures within 30 miles of Judith Basin had implemented some version of the double shield. 3 of them were commercial buildings. The Bitterroot builder had adapted the principle for a sawmill. The variations were, from what she could tell through the reports, intelligent people adapting her adaptation of Edmund's principle to their specific conditions, which was precisely what she had done herself and which she considered the correct use of a principle. In the spring of 1889, Meg turned 11. She was reading at a level that surprised the teacher at the Basin School, a young woman named Ruth Aldous, who had come from Missoula and treated knowledge with the seriousness it deserved. Ruth came to Willa in April and said she thought Meg should have access to more advanced texts than the school could provide. Willa gave her Edmund's engineering notebooks, not the primary one which she kept, but 3 secondary ones from his Fort Sully period, and said Meg could read them when she was ready. Ruth looked at the notebooks, then at Willa, and said, "Your daughter is going to build something." Willa said, "I hope so." Toby was 7 and had decided he wanted to be a farmer, which she considered a reasonable aspiration for a child growing up in Judith Basin. He had also decided without being asked that the flagstone wall was his personal responsibility and spent weekend afternoons inspecting it for shifted courses the way Willa had once inspected it herself. He found a shifted stone in April and reset it correctly before telling her about it. She asked him how he'd known the joint needed to be offset. He said, "You showed me." She could not remember showing him. She must have at some point while he was present and she was working. He had been watching, and she hadn't known he was watching. This was, she thought, how most things were actually transmitted, not through formal instruction, but through proximity and attention, through a child watching a parent work, and understanding without being told they were learning that this was what learning looked like. The winter of 1889 to 1890 was mild by Judith Basin standards. The temperature dropped to single digits in January, but did not hold below zero for extended periods. She burned 3/4 of a cord in January, which was the least she had burned in any January since arriving. The wall was in its fourth winter. The flagstone had settled into permanent position, the courses dense and true, the gap maintaining its 20 inches with no drift accumulation to speak of. It required no maintenance beyond the occasional shifted stone in spring. She wrote less in her notebook that winter, not because there was less to observe, but because what she was observing had become ordinary. In the best sense of the word, the cabin was warm, the children were growing, the principle continued to hold. Ordinary was what she had built toward. Ordinary was the outcome. She had spent 2 winters treating survival as an engineering problem, and the engineering had solved the problem, and now she was living in the solution, which looked, from the outside, like just a cabin with a stone wall and nothing remarkable about it at all. Douglas came in February of 1890 to tell her that the commercial building in Billings had gone through its second winter without stock damage. His client was so satisfied he had asked Douglas to build a second structure using the same approach for a warehouse on the south side of town. Douglas had already begun the plans. He showed her the drawings spread on the table the way Edmund used to spread his drawings, weighted at the corners with whatever was closest. She looked at the gap dimensions he'd specified. She suggested he increase the overhang ventilation on the south side given Billings' specific wind pattern. He adjusted the drawing on the spot with the quick confidence of a man who has learned to trust the source. Meg, sitting at the other end of the table with Edmund's secondary notebook open, looked up at the drawing without being invited to and said, "The gap on the east side is wrong. If the wind comes from the northwest, you need the east gap to be narrower, or you'll get a draft tunnel between the two structures when you build the second one." Douglas looked at her. She was 12 years old. He said, "How do you know about draft tunnels?" Meg held up the notebook. "Page 31, she said, and went back to reading. Douglas looked at Willa. Willa said nothing. She was watching her daughter's face, the focused downward tilt of it, the pencil moving to underline something on the page. The same tilt, the same pencil. She had looked at this face for 12 years, and in this moment, she saw in it something that wasn't her, wasn't Edmund, was something that had come through both of them and become its own thing entirely, the way principles become applications, and applications become in time the new principle. She looked at Douglas. He looked back at her over the drawing, and in his face was something she had not expected to see there, which was uncomplicated pride, not in her, or not only in her, but in all of it, in Edmund's notebooks, in the flagstone wall, and the girl at the end of the table correcting his draft tunnel on page 31. It was the face of a man who had been wrong about something important, had known it for 2 years, and had decided that the correct response to having been wrong was to be useful. She turned back to the drawing. She said, "Meg is right about the east gap. Narrow it to 14 inches. Douglas adjusted the drawing. The spring of 1890 was the first spring Willa did not check the stone wall every morning. She checked it once in April, the way she checked the well and the garden beds and the root cellar, a seasonal inventory, methodical rather than anxious. The base course was solid. The joint offset had held through 4 freeze-thaw cycles. 2 stones in the northern section had shifted slightly over the winter, and she reset them in an afternoon, Toby beside her handing up stones from the small reserve pile she kept along the creek bank. When they finished, she stood back and looked at the wall the way she had looked at it on the day she completed it, practically assessing what she saw against what she needed. It was still 42 feet on the western face and 26 on the northern. The gap was still 20 inches. The stone was weathered, now gray, going to silver in places, the faces blurred slightly by 4 winters of exposure. It looked like something that had been there for a long time. In a sense, she thought it had been. It had existed in Edmund's notebook for 8 years before she built it. It had existed in the logic of physics longer than that. She had not invented it. She had only recognized it and done the labor of making it real, which was perhaps the thing that most needed doing in most situations, not the invention of new principles, but the willingness to act on the ones already understood. She pressed her palm flat against the face of the stone the way she had on the day Cade and the Helena surveyor rode away. The stone was cool from the night, slow to warm despite the April sun, rough under her palm, dense. She pressed harder, feeling the full weight of the wall through her hand, 42 feet of it, 26 feet of it, 6 feet high, laid course by course in December, cold with hands that hadn't known how to do it until they did it. She held her hand there, the stone held back. Then she lifted her hand, turned toward the cabin where Toby was already at the door waiting for breakfast, and walked inside.